And let my notebook. What do you say? I'm messing up. You have to talk right now. Trying to shit back. I'm calling from Grace Hall.
Okay. All right. That's the study guide. It'll be very similar to our first exam. There'll be a mix of short answer. There'll probably be a multiple choice for kind of terminology, vocabulary type things. There'll be some multiple choice questions. I'm not gonna ask you the ecologist scientist thing again, like that's no matching in that area. There might be another, like, again, vocabulary matching section. Those seem to, I can pack a lot of information into like 10 questions. You can earn extra credit on your exam in 2 ways. Like, there'll be extra credit questions on the exam, but there are 2 other options. If you wear a Halloween costume to class on Thursday, you can get between 0.5 and 1.5 points added to your raw score of your exam. It's a sliding scale. The more involved your costume tends towards 1.5 points. I will be wearing a headband with candy corn on it. That's a 0.5 point. Okay. So, like, as involved as you want to be, you could be involved, but there's also like a base level of involvement.
Isn't that like November 2nd?
No, it's the 31st.
Oh, is it the 31st?
Yeah, it's like actually Halloween on Thursday.
Oh, that's a good day.
Thursday on Halloween, wear a Halloween costume, you can get some extra credit. The other thing is next Tuesday, exam day, is election day. And if you vote, you can get a point of extra credit on your exam as well. Okay, and again, if you are not registered to vote, another voting age registered adult in your orbit that votes counts for you. Okay, like, I recognize that I have students that are not yet old enough to vote, and definitely I have people who have the voting deadline was back in October for registration. And so if you're not registered to vote, someone else in your orbit that votes is fine. You take a picture of yourself with your I voted sticker on. You can still get them when you vote. And you send that to me on email, or you tweet it at me, and I'll give you my Twitter name later today or on Thursday, and you'll get the extra credit points. I have to have visual proof that you voted from your voting sticker. And again, like, you can take this picture anytime until the polls close on Tuesday. It counts. So you can go before class, you can go after class. I think polls are open till 8 in Omaha. They usually open at 8 a.m. They might be earlier in your district. Okay. Yeah, do you have a question?
No, I just realized you said this Thursday, not I would almost show up to test on the test day wearing a Halloween costume.
No, Thursday on Halloween. So Thursday is costume day.
That'd be funny.
You good?
Tuesday is voting day and test day.
Got you.
I might give you like a 1/4 point of extra credit.
I was
What if we
found that
take
out
a
on Thursday
picture
before it
of-
messed up.
And you would have been like, dang it. The other thing I would say is that I've heard from a couple of you about independent project ideas, and most of you I have not heard from. And
I was
that,
confused,
yeah,
but-
that's cool. Okay, that's cool. What I am thinking is that I am gonna be in lab Friday, like normal lab time, and you come. I'm gonna put like some times on the board. You come at your time, and we talk and get you a project idea and get you either started that day Friday or get the list in of what you're gonna need to start the next Friday. Okay. And so we'll dedicate. If I haven't heard from you on email by Friday. If you do contact me on email, I'll try to have stuff ready for you to go on Friday, or you can come grab your equipment and go, or be in the lab and do stuff. Otherwise, come into lab on Friday, talk to me at a set time, and we'll get you a project. We'll get you started and going. Okay. I definitely feel that that's the lack of project ideas is my fault. And like, I have not done enough to ferment you guys getting ideas and being ready to go. It's like, this will just magically happen. And it's like, no, it won't. When does that ever happen? Never. So let's take a day. Let's figure it out. Let's do good projects. Have some fun stuff to talk about. Okay. So give me a second here. There's going to be some interaction today where you can do some stuff with each other with groups as we're talking about competition today, and I'll put some times on the board. You can come right when it's convenient for you to come in. And again, like on Friday, the earlier you come and talk to me, like the better chance we can get you to actually start at Friday.
Do you want to sign up like via email or?
No, I'm gonna write it on the board. You can come write your name on it.
Oh, okay.
And that way,
Today?
I'll know when you know. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll know when you'll know when we leave class. Okay, we're still talking about interspecies competition. The idea that we spent several lectures talking about how organisms of one species can influence each other in a density-dependent fashion, but species don't exist in isolation. They interact with one another. And so competition between two different species is interspecies competition. And we have couched this in our discussion about niches, and that there is a fundamental niche, a place where organisms can exist based upon their physiology, their tolerances, and environmental conditions. And then their realized niche, where they do actually exist geographically, where they do actually have their territory, is a function of their interaction with other species. And one of those types of interaction is competition. The other big one is predation, which we're going to hit next week after we take our first exam. So we're going to talk about just a little bit more about interspecies competition, and we're going to spend most of today quantifying competition. And how can we apply mathematics, particularly the Lotka-Volterra equations, in order to be able to say what's going to happen when certain types of organisms interact. And it's one of these beautiful places where like something that actually happens with organisms can be explained with like hard math. And to me, that is like reassuring. It's like, it's not just crazy town out there in the environment where I can never understand this. I can actually take some logic and apply it and make sense of the world around me. And the Lotka-Volterra equation definitely gives us that interaction. We have the squirrel and the sparrow here. They are competing for the cracker. That's interspecies competition. Okay, all right. So a little bit of review. Something that will be definitely a question next Tuesday is to tell me what are the 3 consequences to individuals that come from intraspecies competition. Can you tell me the difference between a fundamental and a realized niche? I just kind of did that. And then what is the Ali effect? So turn to your neighbor, see if you can answer definitely the first and the last question. I kind of told you the difference between fundamental and realized niche.
Stress levels?
Yeah.
Hormonal changes would be like increase your reproduction. It sounds like growth, or like increase your mortality rates, increase your chance of survival. Decrease reproduction and growth. Mortality. Was that 2? Said increased reproduction, increased growth, and changes in the survival mortality. Okay, go.
Okay. Tell me the 3 consequences to individuals of competition.
Have reduced growth rate,
Good.
increased individual mortality rate,
You got it.
or reduce your individual reproduction capability.
Good. Study with Carl for the exam. Okay, Carl knows where the stuff is in his notes. Okay, those are them. We talked about fundamental and realized niches. Fundamental is what is actually possible for an organism based on tolerances. Realized is where an organism actually occurs. The hyperspace of different conditions that actually correlates and is equal to the geographic range of the organisms. And we had a couple examples where the realized niche is usually a subset, is less than the fundamental niche, and that's due to competition and predation. What is the Ali effect?
Birth rates decrease, mortality increases, and population becomes negative.
When? What size is the population?
Small.
At small populations.
It's like the spiral thing.
Yeah, and we get this
It spirals
extinction
into
vortex, minimum viable population size problems. We see that the competition effects are density dependent, as Carl gave us the list. That happens at high population numbers when lots of individuals are competing for the same resources. In some organisms, the same thing happens at small population sizes. It becomes hard to find a mate. Social structure breaks down for feeding and foraging or predation purposes. And because of that, you can get stuck at a small population size. And that's really concerning for conservation biology. We want to know if that's a possibility for a species, and then to recognize that those species that are susceptible to the Lee effect need to have a higher minimum viable population size than like buffalo, that, you know, there can be 3 of them and we'll get more buffalo. Okay. But like if there are 3 prairie dogs, we are not going to get more prairie dogs. Like there's something in their behavior physiology that has problems with small populations. Okay.
What did you say for fundamental and realized is?
So fundamental is what's possible for an organism, like its tolerances
I
for
got you.
temperature and water and nitrogen and phosphorus, sunlight. And realized then is where it actually lives. Like where do we actually find it in the ecosystem? And that's usually a subset of where it can live.
Okay, gotcha.
So fundamental is like this big total place that you can be, but realized is where you actually
Like a
occur.
tiger could potentially be in Central Park.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Like a tiger could live there, but it doesn't.
Yeah.
Because it's not part of its realized niche, unless we like sit it there.
Gotcha.
And that it applies to people too, right? Like we can live anywhere on the planet now, but we don't really live in the North Pole and the South Pole. We don't live in the middle of the desert. I mean, there are populations and cultures that do, but our realized niche is less than what our possible is. Okay, cool. All right. We had talked about and said that there were these 6 different types of interspecies competition interactions. And we had talked about 3 of them, and I said there were 3 more, and we will talk about them on Tuesday. And so here are the other 3. And again, just like for members of the same species, members of different species have contest and exploitation interactions around competition. They become kind of more diverse and somewhat more formalized when we have different species. And again, we talked about overgrowth, and we talked about preemption, and we talked about exploitation, where you eat something and then it's not available for something else. We can also have chemical interactions between members of different species. And this is where we have chemicals that are produced by one organism that kills or inhibits other species. So some plants make bactericidal compounds that prevent certain types of bacteria from growing on them and becoming a disease for them. Some types of plants produce insecticides. Butterflies can be toxic to certain bird species, okay? This is chemical interaction in order to interact with other organisms. Allelopathy is what we call it when it's a plant that's releasing one of these compounds that inhibits the germination or establishment of others. And so we're in a pine forest in this particular picture, and the pine needles tend to, as they break down, produce very acidic soils. In addition, they produce this bed of overlapping pine needles that really prevents sunlight from reaching the soil underneath. And that change in pH to being acidic and low sunlight then prevents the growth and germination of plants underneath. And so you get in the pine forest that has really heavy and close dense trees, almost nothing as the undergrowth underneath these trees because of their decomposing pine needles, okay? As the start of this system. It's pretty cool. It's also why using pine needles is an excellent mulch, because it really prevents weed growth in your flower beds. It's like a thing if you have an excess of pine needles in your yard.
That prevent everything from growing now?
Very much. And so it'll prevent other trees and flowers that you might want to plant there and grow there from growing too. So you have to there's balance. And this is one way, again, where a climax community of a full old growth conifer forest of this type can almost have lower biodiversity in terms of species richness than a community that's on its way to becoming an old growth forest. They prevent the growth of other types of organisms, which lowers overall biodiversity. Okay. The 5th type of interspecies interaction is territoriality, and this is one that overlaps with what's happening inside a species. We can have territorialism between members of different species. And we see this lots of times, again, with certain types of carnivores, and that they're protecting their food base and their resource for themselves. You may see it too among certain types of herbivores particularly as they are protecting water resources, that they will drive off other organisms that might come and take this resource away from them. And in this case, we have behavior that excludes one species from the same area or region as is used by another species. And in doing so, it's a type of contest competition. We have a winner of competition, whoever gets to keep the territory, and we have a loser of the competition, somebody who's excluded. Definitely, we have all these really amazing interactions like the one that we see here that we've documented in and around Yellowstone with the return of the wolves, between wolves and coyotes. And so as the wolves were hunted out of the kind of western United States, coyotes came in and established themselves as the predator for those ecosystems. And as the wolves are reintroduced, they have slowly but surely been driving out the coyotes. And that they're bigger, they're more territorial, they are fiercer, and they have a larger resource base and a bigger territory. And as such, then the coyotes are pushed to the edges of the wolf territory. And in some cases, they're outright killed by the wolves. And in lots of cases, you see interactions like this where we have dominance and submission between the two different species, let alone within the different packs. Coyotes are usually single organisms, and they'll work together as a pair in order to raise kids. But it's very difficult for an individual coyote to take on a wolf pack, godlike, obviously. And so the wolves tend to win. Same thing happens in lions and hyenas. We know that there are all these secondary scavengers that come into lion and cheetah kills, and these bigger organisms that do the actual killing have to fight off these scavengers. They have to establish a territory around their kill site. We'll see it in bears, in that bears will kill an organism or come upon a recently deceased organism, and then they'll bury that carcass and they'll stay in the area to protect it from wolves. And then now that we have lots of different visitors to bear territory for a variety of reasons, we get human interactions with bear territoriality. Okay, the last one is encounter interactions. And this is where we have these non-territorial meetings between organisms. And they're kind of chance interactions. So definitely the squirrel and the sparrow fighting for the cracker, that's a type of encounter interaction. One of them is going to win and have exploitation of it as a consequence. But it's not the chipmunk or squirrel territory or the sparrow territory, but they're still like actually physically interacting with one another in a close space. Here we have jackals and vultures, again, fighting over scavenging rights to a particular kill. Neither one of them sees this area as their territory necessarily. It might be part of both of their home ranges, but they're not out there like defending these things. But they are meeting at these spots where they both have a shared resource. And they'll fight each other for access to it. Again, kind of varies who wins. Like the jackals are relatively small wild dogs, but as a pack, they can take on these larger scavenging birds. But then the birds and the vultures, particularly in Africa, like these are big birds. They can easily drive off a jackal. They have a much harder time with the lions and the hyenas. But when the lions and hyenas have left, then it's kind of more open interaction between these two types of scavengers.
When they're like competing for the kill or whatever, do they like end up killing each other, or do they just run them off?
Usually they run each other off. They both recognize that a serious interaction is likely to cause damage that then leads to your own mortality. And that they very rarely like directly injure each other to the point that they can actually kill them. But getting a wound from a vulture talon is likely to fester and give you an infection that makes you less able to hunt or eat, and eventually you die. And the same thing for the bird. If you get a scratch or a cut or you lose some important wing feathers, like you're at a disadvantage for intra-species competition for resources. That's one reason why elk hunting in Yellowstone is really like a young wolf's game, because as you get older, it's easier to get kicked by an elk and suffer a really like life-ending injury that you cannot have bone growth and recovery from. And that, there's a finite lifespan for wolves in Yellowstone that's much less than in captivity, mostly because of interactions with their own prey. Okay, cool. All right. So as I mentioned at the beginning of class, we can start to quantify competition both like within a species in terms of how many of you are there in comparison to carrying capacity. That's logistic population growth. Our logistic population growth model, this lovely equation here, tells us and allows us to account for species competition within itself. And that as your population gets bigger, your growth rate slows down. That's the effect of intra-species competition. With the expansion of this, and that was arrived at independently by both Lotka and Volterra, these two scientists in the early 1900s that came up with the same solution to competition independently of each other, and then they both expanded on it when it came to predation. We can mathematically account for the effect of a competing species on your carrying capacity as a species, as to how that's going to affect you come population size and population growth. Okay. Let me look at my worksheet. Okay, everybody gets a worksheet, but you can definitely talk to each other. And this scenario, we have an antelope. It has a growth rate R of 0.15. It has a current population size of 250 antelope. And its carrying capacity, or K, is 1,000. And so based upon just this, how many individuals are going to be added? What is Dn in the next time unit? Okay, so if we take these numbers, R is 0.15, current N is 250, and K is 1,000. How many individuals are we going to add to the population in the next year? So it's get your calculator out.
So we have R, N is just number of individuals, you said?
Yep.
And then K is equal to carrying capacity?
Yep.
All the way
Oh,
over
there
there.
I got it.
So what are
Thank
we
you.
trying to find exactly in the equation?
You want to solve it for GNDT.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so just plugging these set numbers into this equation, what is GNDT? How many individuals are going to be added in the next year?
What is DN by itself and DT by itself?
That is the change in population size over a given time period.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
5 times 50. Okay, all right, what do we get?
28.
28.125.
28.125 is like 28 baby antelope, okay? That's how we can solve this equation. If you then added the 28 to your 250, that would be like what's gonna happen the next generation after that, okay? So our population is growing, that's cool.
Is this like a growth rate of like per year or per generational cycle?
I would say per generational cycle, and that then is gonna let you kind of float this time frame around. You know, for an antelope, we're talking about years. You know, that they have a one reproductive cycle a year. If it's bacteria, then it'd be like every couple days.
Yeah.
And again, like that, like ambiguity about time frame lets you like fit it to your organs.
Oh, okay.
Or don't let yourself get stuck on time. Okay, all right. So that lets us quantify like intra-species competition. The more individuals there are, the closer that, you know, N is to 1,000, the more that term becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, and your overall growth rate becomes less and less and less as your population gets bigger. Okay, now imagine that you don't have just one antelope species, you have two species that utilize very similar resources. So here we've got an antelope and we've got a white-tailed deer, which are competing species for forage in the western United States, especially the pronghorn antelope and the whitetail or the mule deer that we see here. So in this case, we now have two species that are utilizing the same resource. And as such, both species are going to act very similarly to each other in terms of their influence on each other. And so in this case, species 2, our mule deer, consumes the same amount of resource as a member of our pronghorn antelope species 1. So what is the impact of having species 2 in the environment on species 1? So if they eat the same thing, they utilize the same resource, how does species 2 affect species 1 in terms of growth rate? And how does it affect the carrying capacity of species 1? What do you think?
A negative trend.
Yeah. And if they're exactly the same, species 2 acts just like a member of species 1 population. And then if you want to consider competition effects, you have to then take into account how many of species 2 there are. And that will draw your overall carrying capacity for species 1. Okay, if you don't take that into account, like you'll overshoot carrying capacity and you'll end up with a population crash. Okay, so in this example, where they have the exact same resource use, a member of species 2 acts just like a member of species 1, and it slows down population growth for species 1. And it effectively reduces the carrying capacity of species 1 by 1 for every member of species 2 that there are. Okay, so let's prove that and answer question 2. Okay. And so in our scenario, we have now a species 2 along with species 1. And what is going to be the effect of having 250 individuals now of species 2 as well as 250 individuals of species 1?
So are we changing the value of k or are we adding to n?
We're adding to n. Okay, and how much are we going to add to n?
250.
250.
So 500.
Yep. So the only thing we have to change here is n. And we now are starting with 500 instead of 250. And I'll go back one slide so you can see the equation. So we get
Do we change n in and out of the brackets too? Or just-
we do changes in both spots.
Are you supposed to get a lower number?
No, because we have a
Okay,
bigger
that's-
population size to
That's
start
what I
with. So you get like, what number do you get here?
37.5.
Yeah, like 37, 38. With the 0.5, it's like, is that another individual or less individual? It's like a half an antelope, right? We're gonna, because there are more individuals, like your population can grow bigger, but that impact on carrying capacity means that your population is that much closer to carrying capacity. And so your population growth is gonna start to slow and feel the effects of competition sooner. You might still be adding individuals very quickly to the population, but you're gonna reach carrying capacity that much sooner.
Oh.
Okay. And so it effectively lowers carrying capacity for your species to have a direct competitor that utilizes the same resources. Okay. Okay, does that make sense? All right.
So will they then be like sharing the amount generated? They'll each do like half of 37.5 per species then, or?
You can, so there are different ways, again, to quantify it, and very rarely do we see organisms that are direct competitors
Oh, okay.
because of this interaction is so negative for both of them. And that this is the competitive natural selective force that causes species to diversify, that causes them to start to utilize specialized resources so they don't have the negative effects of interspecies competition. And what we see is that direct competitors are very rare in nature because they either cause one or the other species to go extinct and you don't see the direct competitor anymore, or because they move away from each other in like niche space. Okay, the other thing that we see is that because of this kind of evolution away from each other due to this really heavy selective force of direct competition, it's not always a full one-to-one interaction between competing species. And so in quantifying competition, what we often do is create these zero growth isoclines. What population sizes does one species essentially stop growing, like it's at carrying capacity? And so this is something that we're going to see in a couple different graphs going forward. So it's worthwhile to think for a minute about what these graphs look like and what they're telling us. A lot of this is coming out of chapter 12 and then moving forward into chapter 13 in our textbook. And they're interesting things to think about, and they're interesting thought problems, but the graphs can get super messy. But we're going to walk through it. Okay, so we're focusing on species 1, our pronghorn antelope. And when there are none of the mule deer, the species pronghorn antelope can reach a full 1,000 carrying capacity of its individuals. Okay. But if there are 250 mule deer in the population, then there can only be 750 of our pronghorn antelope, and together they make 1,000. Okay. And so that's what this zero growth isocline is this combination of possible species population sizes where the growth rate of our species 1, the antelope, becomes 0 because they're at carrying capacity. Okay. Notice that if there are no antelope, there can be 1,000 mule deer. Okay. And so the two intercepts here are usually the things that we can figure out. Okay. So population of species 2 affects how many of species 1 can be there in order to reach carrying capacity for the combined population. When we have direct competitors, we have to take into account the population size of the other species. And so the last question here is, what happens to population size when it's 0? The size of population 2 or mule deer can be all the way up to carrying capacity for the ecosystem. Here we're looking at kind of the growth rates of these two different populations at different points along the graph. And depending upon where you start out, you can have rapid growth of one species, or you can have really slow growth of that species. And that's going to become important for the outcome of competition, is like where you start in this space of possible population sizes affects if you win competition or if you lose sometimes. Okay, and then if you can start out with a robust population, you have access to resources. By having a lot of you can outcompete others for resources. If you start out with very few of you, it's going to be hard with their growth rate of the other population to get enough resources to get your population going. Okay. Does that make a little bit of sense to everybody? Okay, all right. So, as I mentioned, the impact of the two species are not always equal to each other. And so we introduce the competition coefficient in order to make equal a member of one species to the other species that we're talking about. And we're going to work with two species, species 1 and species 2, the antelope and the mule deer today. But you can add another competition coefficient in here. You can go to 3 or 4 species, 5 or 6 that are interacting with each other for a given resource. And they will each and of themselves influence the carrying capacity of the other species. And so a competition coefficient is something that you measure, something that you have to know the life history of your organism and their direct interaction in order to be able to place a number on it. And so that can take a lot of study, and it's not often known for a variety of different species, but we can make some assumptions about it. And there are going to be two that we work with here, and there's going to be alpha, which is this little kind of half of an infinity sign, 3/4 of an infinity sign. And then there's going to be beta, which is our capital kind of Greek B here. And so alpha describes the effect that species 2 has on species 1. And in our previous example, alpha was 1 if they were directly equivalent to each other. But if species 2 doesn't have the full effect of a member of species 1, this can be 0.5, it can be 0.25, it can be 0.01. Okay. The bigger it is, the more similar to species 1 species 2 is, the greater the competition. The smaller the competition coefficient, the less effect it has. Okay. You'll notice then that the y-intercept, when the population of n of the antelope is 0, n1 is 0, this maximum size of the other species becomes the carrying capacity divided by the competition coefficient. And it's not something that I'm going to be like, hey, what is the intercept here? And you like rattle it off, pick it off. It's like, oh, it's competition divided by the carrying capacity divided by competition coefficient. But we're going to see that like k divided by alpha or beta on these graphs, and just like keep in mind that that's carrying capacity divided by competition coefficient. And again, the bigger the competition coefficient, the more that drags this number down closer to 0. Okay, so alpha is about the effect of species 2 on species 1. It's essentially the factor that goes into making a member of species 2 equivalent to a member of species 1. All right, beta then is the competition coefficient that does the reverse. It says, what is the impact of species 1 on species 2? And we can set up these two equations then that let us predict population growth in the future for each of the species, taking into account competition with the other. Okay. And that's what these equations do. They are modifications of the logistic growth population model. And we're saying that the growth rate of species 1 times its current population size is an effector now of its current population size, as well as the competition coefficient times the population size of the other species. And so we take into account how many of the other species there are and how closely competing they are. Okay, and then we flip these subscripts for our species 2. And again, I'm never going to ask you to answer these equations without giving you the equation. Like, that's just cruel and unusual punishment. Because unless you are like doing this for your research, no one remembers this off the top of their head. That's what the internet is for. Okay. But an understanding of it is important in that the normal growth of a population is affected by the number of its competing species, its population size. That's a lovely jiggle. And then how directly competing that other species is with this species. And again, you can add on a whole bunch of these for more populations of interacting species. You just keep adding on the things that you add to the size of your own population with their appropriate competition coefficients.
Is that, in the equations like the K1 and K2, is that being divided by what's just in the parentheses?
It is. So it's 1 minus this whole thing that's on the side. I know that's a totally worthwhile question. And our textbook always writes it in this line fashion and never like gives you the setup of what's on the top and what's on the bottom. And that's where I find the ones I've had on the slide before be a little bit helpful in solving these things. Okay. All right. I want you to now answer question 3 on the worksheet. And so now we have a species 1 has a population size of 400. It has the same growth rate, the same carrying capacity. And now we're increasing the competition coefficient to 1.2 for species 2. And we say that species 2, N2 is 250. How many individuals of species 1 now will be added to the population? Okay, and there's the equation.
So do we just want to multiply 250 times 1.2 and then add that to the 400?
Yes. And that's what's gonna be above K, but that N1 is still gonna stay 400. In the R1, N1, that's still gonna stay 400.
I'm confused.
Okay, so it's gonna be, let me make sure we can write it on the board. Your math,
Could I not just do that, then put it back into the normal equation? Would that not work?
yeah, it's gonna be, so our what we want is gonna be equal to our 0.5 or 0.5 R1 times our N1 400. And that's all gonna be one minus now 400 plus 1.2 times 250 over 1,000.
Oh, okay.
I think I got it.
Okay, so it's just like a modification.
Yeah,
Situation,
it's
but-
totally a modification, yeah. In this case, we're not changing N1 here like we did before.
Just in the first
Yeah,
and second.
Just here. Okay. So. 60. What I get, 400 plus 300 over 1,000, so that's gonna be like 60 times 0.3, right? What's 1 minus 0.7? Check my math. I did it right. I got 18.
I got 18.
Sweet. 18.
Yay.
Okay. So if a competitor is better than you at gaining resources, it really shuts down your potential population growth. Like when we've been calculating these rates before, we got something at 250 that was like 28 individuals, and at 500 it was going to be 37 individuals. And now at 400, which should be between those two numbers, we get 18. Okay? Having a competitor that is better than you at gaining resources, that is more than one of you for each of species 2, is really bad for your population growth. Okay? They're going to get more resources. It's really going to impact how you can add members to your population. Okay. All right. Now let's change that competition coefficient to 1. Okay. Very similar to what we talked about before. So let's make that 1. And what does it do to the number of individuals that we're going to add to our population now when they're exact? We're going to change this to 250.
21.
So we're actually like 0.35, right? Do 1 minus 650, which would be 35. What'd you get?
21.
What did you get? I think I got 21.
I got 21.
I got 60 times 0.35. Is that right? We've got 400 plus 250 is 650. So 1 minus 0.65 is 0.35. And now we get 21. Okay. Is that right? Am I totally crazy?
Are we doing the second one right now?
We're doing 4.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so it went up, our coefficient went down, we can add more members to our species. Do number 5, what happens when that competition coefficient drops to 0.5? Goes even further. So that was more 20.
What do you say the effect on carrying capacity was?
It lowers it. And like what was your carrying capacity now becomes less. There can be less of you on the land because you have a competitor that's also using resources. Okay. And now you can answer question 6. What is the effect of increasing competition coefficient? So we just did this series of the same kind of populations, and all we changed was the competition coefficient. So what is the effect of increasing and decreasing the competition coefficient on species 1? Again, like we're focusing on the antelope.
That's a If I said increasing competition coefficient of species 2 reduces the share of limited carrying capacity for species 1.
Yeah,
A bad way to
definitely.
say it, or does that?
Yep. That sounds good. So increasing competition coefficient with species 2 decreases carrying capacity for you as species 1, and it reduces your growth rate. Like you grow more slowly, right? We went from like, at the most, when we had a low competition coefficient, we added 28, but it was down to 18 if we bump that up to 1.2. And then the reverse is true if you decrease competition coefficient. If your competition coefficient goes down, your species increases the growth rate and your carrying capacity can go up. Okay. Does that make sense? Cool, Olivia, you got to do that exercise.
You almost lost me.
But I got you.
Until we did it. And then I was like, oh.
Until we did it,
I
right?
was like, oh, that's not
No,
that bad.
this stuff is totally like theory, right?
Yeah.
And that's what's interesting is that Locke and Voltaire came up with it theoretically. Like neither of those guys were out there like counting bugs in competition with each other, like doing anything. They were mathematicians and they thought about this and they were like, oh, you know, like there's this interaction between organisms. There's this interaction between two things and it can play out in math this way. And then ecologists were like, that totally explains the stuff we see. Okay, is there a time that works better for you? Take one. Okay, go for it. And again,
There.
you guys are definitely able to like come in at any time, but at 10:10, Olivia and I will sit down and talk about her project.
Where?
In the lab. It's our normal lab, which
Normal lab,
is McDonough 245, I guess. The one on the left side. Come with an idea, come with nothing. Either way, you'll leave with something. Maybe I'll have donuts. That's the nice thing about donuts. Make them seem like they're, I don't know, worse than some terrible.
You eat donuts? I've only seen you with the granola bars and the apples.
Well, so yeah, we don't eat donuts very often, but does not mean that I don't think about donuts all the time. It's typical. It's one of those things where you like know you should eat better, and then like you do, and that's fine until you go to the grocery store or like you have something outside your normal experience, and you're like, oh yes, I'll have 5 slices of deep dish pizza. Okay, all right, so we get it. When we put two species together, again, we can imagine different scenarios of interactions between organisms. And that given certain conditions, then we can predict from these types of interactions what will happen when two species interact with each other. And there are 4 possibilities in general, and again in theory, of what can happen. And so one theory, one scenario is that species 1 has a higher carrying capacity and growth rate than species 2. Okay, so species 1 is always going to be green, and species 2 is going to be orange. Okay, and again, when there are none of species 2, species 1 can be at its carrying capacity, and again, when there are none of species 1, species 2 can be at its carrying capacity, but that's less than species 1. Okay, and in this scenario, if they both start out at low population numbers, species 1 will increase, which is the green arrow in this direction, increasing on this axis. Species 2 can increase. But species 2 will be capped at its carrying capacity, but species 1 can continue to grow. It will win competition. Likewise, if they start out both at high population numbers, they'll both be forced to decline, but species 2, because of its lower carrying capacity, will end up at a lower population size. It'll be outcompeted. If they start in the middle, between the two, species 1 can keep growing in population size to its carrying capacity line, but species 2 is going to dip. And again, species 1 is always going to win. And the key to this particular diagram in your book, which is in figure 13.2, is that the arrows in your book here are miscolored. Okay? Like in your book, this one is orange and this one is green. It's like a total mistake. So past years I've been explaining this and I'm like, that's like wrong. And finally I was like, it's dead wrong. I'm changing the figure. Okay. But in either way, because species 1 carrying capacity is higher, it will win. There will always be more of species 1 than species 2, wherever you start out in whatever combination of numbers on this graph, unless there's none of species 1. Does that make sense? So like species 1 will win because it has a higher carrying capacity. It can always grow and will stop growing at a higher number than species 2. Okay. The flip scenario is totally possible. Okay, if species 2 has a higher carrying capacity than species 1, there can be more of them than species 1, the opposite scenario will happen. The species 2 will win competition. Wherever you start, there will end up being more of species 2 than species 1. Okay, so it matters what your carrying capacity is for an ecosystem as to the outcome of competition. It's not just your interaction, it's what the ecosystem can actually support of you. And the species that wins in this scenario is the one that has the higher carrying capacity. Okay. All right. That's if your 2 lines are parallel to each other and your zero growth isoclines don't intersect. Okay. But they can. All right, and those are the other two scenarios for these interactions. And in the third scenario, we have our two zero growth isoclines. And you'll notice that the carrying capacities of each of these populations, K1 and K2, are less than the carrying capacity divided by the competition coefficient of the other species. When your carrying capacity is less than the effect of the other species on itself, you can stably coexist together, okay? And if we look at each of these possibilities, we see that the two populations collapse towards this stable equilibrium point. You start out at low population sizes, you'll grow here, and you'll fall back to this point. Then species 1 will grow here, but come up to that point. If you start on the outskirts of both, they'll fall back towards their zero growth isoclines. And then as they're moving towards carrying capacity, they'll bump into each other in population size and be able to stick at a point where there's a big population of both of them that's essentially at carrying capacity when you combine the two populations. If you, in this scenario, when the isoclines are in this kind of orientation to each other, if you land in between them, you have one species that declines and one species that increases, but as they're moving along their zero growth isoclines, they'll come back to this E point. Okay, they'll stabilize. And this is coexistence. This is when you have two species whose interaction is such that one doesn't drive the other to extinction. One doesn't always win competition. There's one or a couple points in their zero growth isoclines where they can interact and actually have pretty big populations of both. Okay, nobody wins. They both have relatively high population sizes.
So is this guaranteed to happen if they have the same carrying capacity most of the time?
No. And so it really depends on their interaction with each other.
Okay.
And that if you have the flipping, the fourth scenario here is if you flip these 2 points, okay? If your carrying capacities are on the outside, one species will win. And it depends on where you start as to which species wins, but one will drive the other to extinction, okay? And you end up with this unstable equilibrium point rather than a stable one. So when carrying capacities are on the outside, you can have a winner again of competition. And that for these points where you're in between the two zero growth isoclines, you'll move towards the carrying capacity of the species that starts out as more abundant.
But the equilibrium, the stable one, can only happen if they have equal carrying capacities.
If they're, we're going to see here, if each species inhibits the growth of each other less than they do themselves, they can stably coexist.
Okay.
But if both species inhibit the growth of each other more than themselves, they'll have an unstable coexistence. And it will depend on who is more abundant first as to who wins competition. So the fourth scenario is an unstable equilibrium, and where the point where they intersect is not stable, and that whoever starts out with a higher population size will win resources because they can grow to their carrying capacity while the other species can't.
I see the third graph.
Yeah.
Okay. I see the difference, but
It's very fine. And again, it's this understanding that the life history of an organism, that the environment of an organism affects the outcome of competition. It's not just the interaction between the species. And then you layer onto that the interaction of the species and where you start out at as population size. And so again, you have this fundamental niche where you can exist. You have these isoclines of possibilities. You have carrying capacity. And then you have what actually happens in the environment. How many of you there are to begin with, how many of your competitor there are. That affects the outcome of competition. It affects, will you end up living together happily or will you be driven to extinction? And showing you these plots is easy. Okay, like look, if you're here, this happens, and if you're here, that happens. But figuring out where your populations are in reality is very difficult. You can go out and estimate population size and say, okay, I have 250 mule deer and I have 400 antelope. What does that mean? What will happen to them? Okay, you can use this math to start to make predictions. You can, based upon their growth rate and how they interact with each other, you can estimate, is there a stable equilibrium or not? Are antelope a better competitor and there will always be more of them than mule deer, or is it the other way around? You can make the estimations and then you have to go out and ground truth your theories, your hypotheses that you get from these types of equations. And lots of times we estimate that there will be a stable or unstable equilibrium, and then we go out and say, okay, this species should win, and it doesn't. It goes extinct. And you're like, well, what was it? And then it's very interesting to figure out, was there a competitor? Was there a predator? Was there something I had misunderstood about their life history that caused my equations to be wrong? This is one place where modeling gives us these like amazing results, and you're like, wow, we can predict everything about the environment, and it's like, in theory. And the result really depends on where you start. And so again, what might happen on the exam is I might give you a graph like this, and I might say, okay, at point D, what is gonna happen to the orange population and the green population? Is it gonna increase or decrease? Does that then mean that they can live together happily, or that one will go extinct?
K2 will outcompete K1 and unstable equilibrium.
That's right, exactly.
Ooh.
Yeah. And that's as deep into these types of graphs as I would go, is that given a bit of a background about what these numbers mean and how to read them, given this, what would happen?
So would A make a stable equilibrium, or what happen at A?
They could, if they start out in the right kind of space, like right here at A, they might end up at the equilibrium, and they might be okay. And the same thing at B is like, if you're right there at that perfect point on the line where it's going to work together just perfectly, you might fall back to the equilibrium.
Go either way, you're saying. Okay.
It's much less stable than here where all of them head towards E.
Yeah.
There's much less give in the fourth scenario. Okay. All right. So they can, there's lots of evidence that in 3 of these 4 scenarios, one species wins competition, right? One species drives the other to extinction. It depends on which species it is, depending upon your conditions. But in 3 out of the 4 scenarios, one species causes the other to be extinct. And so, is that true? Is that what we really see? And the first evidence and the first kind of testing of the Lotka-Volterra hypotheses and their equations was done in the lab. And we grew some different types of bacteria and small organisms that grew really quickly in order to test these types of hypotheses. And we can do it with invertebrates and fish in the lab too, and certain types of plants. And these types of competitive exclusion experiments really bore out the findings of Lotka-Volterra that in most instances, one species wins and the other disappears. Okay, so in this case, we're growing 2 different types of paramecium bacteria, or protists, I should say. They're little ciliates, they're cool guys. If you've seen them on a slide, they scoot around and engulf stuff. They're totally fun to have in the lab. Grown separately, they can each reach a certain carrying capacity for the system. Notice that the blue guy, Paramecium aurelia, has a higher carrying capacity. It can grow to higher population densities than can our other paramecium. When you grow them, okay, the one with the higher carrying capacity wins. Okay, it's the one that's able to reach maximum density, and it drives the other one to extinction. So we see that the outcome of our predictions from Lotka-Volterra hold in this very artificial setting, that the species with higher carrying capacity wins competition for this resource. Okay. We call this competitive exclusion, again, when one species drives another to extinction. That term was coined by Gauss in these Gauss competitive exclusion experiments. Here we see it again with the 2 different types of protist silicates. They each have used silica in order to make their little glass houses that they live in. They're these little diatoms. This guy draws down silica faster than this guy does. Notice this guy has like a steeper kind of slope than this one. Is that right? No, it's the other way around. This guy's slope here is a little bit steeper than this one. And again, you can see when they kind of reach this little dot here is at like 9 days, and here it's like 7 days. Okay, so this guy is a better competitor, the blue guy, than our orange at the top. When we grow them together, sure enough, the blue guy wins. Okay, he gets access to the resource faster, and thus he establishes himself as a population more fully sooner, and he can outcompete the orange guy for the silica resource. And as a result, the orange guy goes extinct.
Doesn't looks like the orange guy has a higher carrying capacity though, doesn't
It could be, but
he? He just couldn't establish capacity.
he couldn't establish that. It depends. So like that's the point where
That's
R
interesting.
really starts to matter.
Cool.
It is cool. Okay. And so this is super interesting in that coexistence is possible in only one of these 4 scenarios, and that competitive exclusion should happen in most instances. And yet, what we observe is coexistence. We have all these different species that live together, and they aren't deriving, we don't have extinctions left and right happening all the time. We don't see communities that are composed of one species, one plant species, and one animal species. They live together. And so it's the predictions of Laco Volterra like don't hold true. And so that becomes very interesting to consider as like what invalidates these assumptions underlying this mathematical model and what is actually possible. And the answer is that because it changes. Organisms change over time and the environment changes over time. And that opens up niche space. That opens up places where organisms are not directly competing with each other, which means that these predictions don't have to hold because that's not what's actually happening. Okay, here we have a question, what condition is necessary for coexistence to be possible? And so we see coexistence in C down there where we have the stable equilibrium. And what has to be true for coexistence is that, hang on, each species inhibits its own growth more than by the other. Okay, each species inhibits its own growth more. It has a greater impact on itself. Its carrying capacity is inside that of the other carrying capacity divided by competition coefficient. If you affect yourself more than your competitor, you can coexist. You can control your own destiny. But if your competitor has a bigger effect on you than you do, you can't live with each other very happily. Okay. On Thursday, we'll pick up with this idea of competitive exclusion and then what we actually see. We're going to call it resource partitioning and resource specialization, compartmentalization. There are possibilities that happen because the environment is variable and because organisms are not static and because they can change it. Okay, cool. Wear your costume Thursday. Sign up for when you want to come talk to me on Friday. Turn in your homework if I don't already have it. And I'll take your worksheet. I will take your homework and your worksheets. Oh, you can add. Perfect.
I'll wear a pirate.
No.